further ado, I'd like to introduce our first storyteller. This is his second time telling a story at Naked Truth. He is the guitarist and vocalist for Hank 4 and the drummer for the Icky Boyfriends. He books bands at the Hemlock Tavern and comedy for Club Chuckles. He is the co-founder of the Coalition for Aging Rockers, and he is a fabulous storyteller. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Bedard.
Thank you, Kara. Here we go. A little room to work with. When I first started attending college in the early 1980s, I never dreamed that Spuds MacKenzie, the Budweiser original party animal, would one day save me from being evicted from university housing. I was breaking a lot of rules in those days. My undergraduate advisor at the time was the noted anarchist historian Howard Zinn, author of The People's History of the United States. He's a mentor, advisor, big influence on my life. And Howard had a take on rules, and in a nutshell, he thought that if there was a rule, like or a law, for example, that you thought was unjust, that you had a moral right or an obligation to act against that rule or law, such as if there's a law that is in favor of slavery, that you can act in accordance with your moral code to work against that, and that you are morally in the right. So that was sort of Howard's take, and like I said, he's an anarchist. And so around that time, and the president of Boston University at the time, his name was John Silber. And Silber was basically the polar opposite of Howard. John was an authoritarian personality. He was affiliated with the Reagan-Bush administrations. He was in favor of military intervention in Afghanistan. He supported the right-wing dictatorships in Central America. He supported the government of South Africa during the heyday of the apartheid era. And he loved to find ways to exact revenge on students and faculty who either spoke out against him or against the university's policies. So around my sophomore year, I got involved with student government at Boston University. And I booked a lecture series that did pretty well. I brought the New Zealand ambassador. I brought a series of ambassadors who had critical things to say about the United States or policy disagreements with the United States. I brought them to campus, and it was a big hit series. And somehow, that led to the outgoing president of the College of Liberal Arts Student Government pulling me aside one day and saying, "Hey, Anthony, would you be interested in being the president of the College of Liberal Arts Government next year?" And I was like, "No way." I was like, "What? You don't want to do it?" No, I'm not interested in running for anything or against anybody or making any promises. He said, "What if I could tell you that you would run unopposed? And not only would you run unopposed, you would have a $25,000, $30,000 budget to spend next year, no questions asked." Not having to answer to anybody, I said, "I'm very interested in both of those things." And so the next year I came back, my junior year, the newly installed, I was worried there for a minute, even like on the day of the election, I was like sweating bullets thinking that somebody's gonna come out of the woodwork and oppose me at the last minute. And, but nobody did. And so I was installed as the president, as it were, and given a budget. Now, there was a university, large student government, but this was a smaller college government. So basically it was $5 a head for the 5,000 students in the college. So that was the $25,000 budget. And I said to myself, as inspired by Howard, that I was going to go and spend that money on the most liberal left-wing programming that I possibly could to basically do battle with the the right-wing forces who ran the university. We brought people to campus like Angela Davis, the journalist Alexander Coburn, Julian Bond, the radical feminist poet Adrienne Rich. And and not only were we creating original programming, but more importantly, we were even giving money to all the radical student groups that had no hope of ever getting a dime out of the university. the Radical Black Student Union, Radical Feminists. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, and these were, groups with some intellectual radical agendas and wanted to put on programming that the university was absolutely going to shut down or not approve. So all of a sudden, there's this like wellspring of $25,000, and we're spending it as we see fit and causing quite a stir on campus for a previously, unknown, small college student government. So at this time, or around this time, the president of BU, John Silber, decided that he was going to award a humanitarian degree to the president of El Salvador, Jose Napoleon Duarte. And this is like in 1985, 1986. So some of you may remember that this was the height of the death squad era in El Salvador. Thousands of people were disappearing, being murdered, tortured, mass graves, people just disappearing, and it was a horrible political situation for which the United States was largely responsible and contributed quite a bit of money and political cover for. And Silber said, well, and this was his way. This was totally his style. Was like, not only, Napoleon Duarte is a humanitarian, and I'm going to give him an honorary degree. So everybody is completely outraged, myself included. And with about a week or two's notice, I pulled together a multi-part lecture series that examined different areas or facets of the political situation in El Salvador. And Howard Zinn even said, well, why don't you go see Noam? See if you can talk Noam Chomsky into coming over here. My buddy Noam. And so next thing you know, he puts the word in for me, and I'm take the trek over to MIT across the river. And one afternoon, I find myself sitting across the desk in Noam Chomsky's office. This is a man who was booked years into the future. And I, basically explained the situation to him, asked him if he wouldn't mind canceling some previous engagement. So intimidated. I mean, he's a man of few words. Howard is very gregarious and outgoing, very warm and personable, and Noam is obviously, he's a little more austere and kind of, reserved. So I'm totally sweating bullets. And, Dr. Chomsky, if you would consider canceling your appointment and coming over here and speaking at our event. And he's, oh, yeah, okay, I think I will. I think I'll do. I was shocked. I was like, what? You will? So all of a sudden, we've got a lecture on our hands that was attended by, basically the night before Napoleon Duarte shows up in Boston to receive this high-profile honorary degree. We've got an even bigger public event. Thousands of people attended, one of the biggest lecture halls in the Boston University campus, and it wasn't just students. It was people from all over Boston and Cambridge, the public, huge press coverage. It was a major public relations black eye for the university to have their visiting dignitary taken down by Noam Chomsky, America's foremost foreign policy critic, on the eve of his visit. And I have to admit, like I said, the whole thing came together kind of last minute, right? We had to move quick, cut a few corners here and there, and I think at this point I have to admit I was not following all the rules and regulations of good student government. I was actively ignoring many rules and regulations of good student governance, and most importantly, and most unforgivably, I was ignoring Robert's Rules of Order. So, not liking the way that I did things, or perhaps even my political bent, two people in the student government ratted me out to the dean. My attitude was, I hadn't promised anybody anything. I ran unopposed. I could do whatever. That's my thinking. I'm like, I'll do whatever in the hell I want. But then next thing I know, I'm getting called in front of the dean, and I'm being threatened with removal from office for failure to adhere to the student code of conduct and the rules of student governance. So, I talked my way out of it. I got called back in there several times over the next few months, and it really was kind of an increasingly, tenuous situation for me. And so what I did was I stacked the deck with more friends of mine who I knew were going to vote in my favor, vote for my proposals for this slate of ultra left-wing programming, and I just kept on doing what I was doing. So this really put me on the university shit list. They were at this point they were very, very unhappy with me, and I was a marked man. Okay, the other big political issue at the time was divestment in South Africa. Now, people may remember divestment was a political movement in colleges and universities where the students were attempting to talk their colleges into divesting themselves of any financial holdings or activity in South Africa as a way of putting pressure on the South African government to end the regime of apartheid. And it was a national issue. It was a hot button issue. It wasn't necessarily my issue. I was more concerned with some other things at the time. But I supported that thing in general. And of course, John Silver, the president of BU, turned around and said, "Not only will we not divest in South Africa, I am announcing a new policy of increased investment for the government of South Africa." And people lose their minds. So there's the big student activist on this particular issue. His name was Joseph Abramowitz. He was in the theology school. And Joseph was a high visibility. He was not only just locally, but nationally, he was known for being a leading student activist in the anti-apartheid movement. So Joseph was like a high profile, public relations, letters to the editor, public events and all this kind of stuff. And then he made the mistake of hanging a bunch of signs and banners in his window and off of his balcony that urged BU to divest. And BU subsequently notified him that he was in violation of a very mysterious regulation or rule that was on the book, which later became known as the BU banner policy. That basically there was a policy on the books which prohibited any student from hanging a sign or a poster or a banner in your window or off the balcony. We were an urban school mixed in with the city architecture, and so I think this was a way that they thought up to basically kind of keep the university looking good on the outside mixed in with the rest of the city buildings. But the reality was they had actually selectively enforced their own policy to discriminate against Joseph on the basis of his political content. This is not surprising given the whole history at Boston University, but that's what they did. And so he refused to take down the signs and banners. They kept telling him, he said no, they kept telling him, and then finally they came into his room, physically confiscated the banners, and they expelled him from housing. And this is all for basically hanging a sign that said, "BU divest." And meanwhile, across town, in a much nicer section of the campus where I lived, I was fully outraged. And I said, well, this is bullshit. Joseph has the right to say whatever he wants. And I took a bed sheet off my bed, and I spray painted a pro-Joseph slogan in like 3 colors of spray paint. And I hung it off the balcony. Historic Bay State Road, like the painted ladies, here in San Francisco, out in, Alamo Square. So like Bay State Road is that kind of a road in Boston with these gorgeous brownstones, a historic neighborhood, and all of a sudden this ugly ass sheet, with 3 different colors of spray paint with kind of a First Amendment message, if you will. And I came home I put the banner up and left for class. I came home later that afternoon and saw that the banner was missing. I went into my dorm room. The banner had been confiscated by university officials, and there was a letter for me announcing that I, too, had just been expelled from housing. And so at this point, I was really starting to get worried. I called my parents. My parents are freaking out. What got you expelled from housing? What did you do? What happened? And it's like they didn't have any money to put me up anywhere else. Where was I going to go? Was I going to be able to graduate? Couldn't I just dial it back a notch? That's really what they wanted to know. And another friend, a friend said, well, why don't you call the American Civil Liberties Union? I thought that was pretty good advice. And I did. And I registered a complaint. I had no idea if it was ever going to lead to anything. But a week later, I got a phone call that invited me down to a meeting at a law firm in downtown Boston. I went to the meeting, and Joseph Abramowitz was there, as were 2 other students who had also been evicted from housing for violating the banner policy in support of Joseph. So within a couple of days' time, the 4 of us were co-defendants in a First Amendment lawsuit against Boston University. And the first thing that we needed to do was get a temporary restraining order so that they wouldn't evict us from housing. That was job number 1. And then the second thing was that we needed to prove that they had selectively enforced their own policy on the basis of discrimination against political content. Now, BU said that their banner policy applied to everyone across the board. They also argued that even if they hadn't, that they were exempt from certain laws of the state of Massachusetts because they were a private institution and not a public one, and therefore they were exempt from the First Amendment. A university is arguing this in state court. And so we went around, and they were, you know, I guess maybe the people working for the university, as a lot of hatchet men and yes men aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer. We went around campus even after we had been evicted, and we took pictures of signs and banners that were hanging all over campus. And I'm talking Bruce Springsteen posters, Phi Beta Kappa banners, and yes, Spuds McKenzie, the original party animal, and his south of the border cousin, Spuds McKenzie, the original Fiesta animal. And we entered, you know, these photographs into evidence. And, you know, basically it was a months-long, drawn-out, dragged-out trial. And the university sent up all their top guys up there, and those guys, they lied through their teeth. I mean, it was just incredible to everyone involved that these guys were going up there and lying about this, you know, uniform enforcement of a policy when that clearly wasn't the case. And ultimately, the judge did rule in our favor. We won an across-the-board victory. It was a months-long process, but we won a resounding victory. They weren't able to kick us out of housing, and though this wasn't our original intent, because of BU's defense, the judge wound up making what turned out to be a historic ruling in the history of the state of Massachusetts, and that is all institutions, public or private, have to adhere to the laws of the Constitution. So that's a radical legal finding, but one which BU was trying to argue their way out of. And so let's, you know, fast forward and, you know, to the next semester, and still wasn't done with them. I was still carrying a pretty big time grudge. And for one of Howard Zinn, one of his graduate courses, he was really into the idea of doing history that had an impact in the here and now, not writing history for a book that somebody might happen to read in, you know, a couple of years or decades down the road, but something that has an immediate impact for now. So I went and I researched the history of civil liberties violations at Boston University and wrote a multi-part series for the school paper. I uncovered evidence that Boston University had more violations of civil liberties, and I'm not just talking free speech, but I'm talking like the general blanket category of human civil liberties in this country, that BU had more violations than any other institution in the 400-year history of the state of Massachusetts, public or private. BU was the #1 violator, and I wrote a multi-part series for the school paper. Everyone got to read it. More shame heaped upon this administration. And I'm going to say that, just in closing, that I thought to even tell the story tonight because 2 weeks ago, John Silver, the BU president, he also gained some notoriety. He ran for governor of the state of Massachusetts back a few, 15, 20 years ago. Some of you may remember that. Thank God he did not get elected. But he passed away 2 weeks ago, and there was, I read several of the obituaries, and many of them talked about his work in kind of elevating Boston University from a half-assed, broken-down university into a, powerhouse education, higher institute. And then it talked about all that kind of stuff, but nobody talked about the other things, the horrible, evil right-wing shit that he did and was in bed with. And all I can say is that he died surrounded by, he died at an old age, surrounded by loving, a huge loving family. And that's a lot more than people who lived in El Salvador, South Africa, or Afghanistan, or a number of other places. My graduation speaker was William Rehnquist. I mean, this was like a serious right-wing institution. And he died surrounded at an old age, surrounded by his loved ones, and it's a lot more than anybody who suffered under these various, torture regimes that he provided material and intellectual support for. So, you're not supposed to talk ill about the dead, but even though he died, I'm not sad that he's gone. Thank you very much.